Richard knew who you were before he found you.
Why were you watching my mother?
Because she discovered what his family buried.
The first laugh reached me halfway down the aisle, and although whoever made it tried to bury the sound beneath the organ music, I knew exactly why 300 people had gathered to watch Alexander Whitmore marry me. Some were friends, some were business partners, and some had come because wealthy families treated weddings like mergers with flowers, but enough of them had spent the previous month discussing my body online that I recognized the amusement before I saw the faces. Alexander could have married Evelyn Mercer, whose family owned enough commercial property to alter a city map, or any of the polished women photographed beside him at charity dinners. Instead, he had chosen Claire Bennett, 29 years old, 5'6", 240 pounds, and still managing the pastry department at the Blackstone because I had refused to let marriage turn employment into a hobby I no longer needed. When another guest whispered that Alexander could have had anyone, my hand tightened around the bouquet, and Alexander noticed without moving toward me. 3 months earlier, he would have crossed the aisle and handled the insult himself. That afternoon he waited, because I had finally taught him that protecting someone and taking away her choices could look disturbingly similar. I continued walking until the chapel doors opened behind me and Margaret entered almost 10 minutes late, still wearing the dark coat she had apparently thrown over her wedding clothes after leaving an emergency meeting downtown. Alexander's mother rarely hurried, yet she moved down the aisle without acknowledging anyone until she saw the crescent-shaped scar behind my left ear, exposed where the stylist had pinned my hair. Her expression changed so sharply that I turned, wondering whether she was ill, and the small silver clutch in her hand slipped against the pew before she caught it. She came close enough to speak without giving the guests another piece of entertainment, then asked a question that made no sense until much later. "Claire, what was your mother's name?" I answered Emily Bennett, expecting recognition perhaps, but not the fear that crossed Margaret's face when she looked toward the side entrance where Richard Vale had been standing moments earlier. "Before you marry Alexander," she said, keeping her voice low, "you need to know that Richard knew who you were before Alexander ever walked into the Blackstone." 3 months earlier, Richard had been an unfamiliar man at the hotel bar when I stepped between Noah, our 19-year-old dishwasher, and a customer furious about receiving lemon cake instead of chocolate. The ticket clearly said lemon, but the customer preferred accusing Noah to admitting he had forgotten his own order, and his embarrassment became cruelty once he realized several people were listening. When I offered to replace the dessert, he looked slowly at my waist and suggested that someone with more experience practicing restraint might be better suited to manage pastry. I had spent enough years hearing insults disguised as concern to recognize bait, so I told him his replacement dessert would be complimentary but asked him to apologize to Noah before we served it. He refused until the tall man sitting near the windows lifted his eyes from his coffee, at which point the customer's posture changed with almost comic speed. I knew Alexander by reputation, although most of that reputation consisted of stories people told quietly about the Whitmore family's private security companies, waterfront unions, clubs, construction contracts, and the older generation's habit of solving problems before police reports could explain how those problems began. Alexander never threatened the customer. He merely asked whether apologizing to a teenager had somehow become difficult, and the man apologized because everyone in Chicago understood that Alexander's calm carried consequences his voice did not need to advertise. That bothered me more than it impressed me, which apparently interested him, because after the customer left he asked why I had risked a good job over an employee I barely knew. I told him dignity should not depend on whether the person being humiliated could damage you afterward, and he considered the answer longer than I expected before leaving his card beside an untouched slice of cake. 2 days later he returned with Richard, who introduced himself as counsel and advisor to the Whitmore family, then placed a 3-month relationship contract on my office desk. Alexander needed a convincing partner to end pressure for a strategic engagement to Evelyn, while I would receive enough money to make the down payment on the bakery I had wanted for years. What unsettled me was not the offer but the number, because it matched my financial need with an accuracy no stranger should have possessed. Richard admitted that his office had researched me, then smiled when I called that invasive and suggested doubling the fee if embarrassment was the obstacle. Alexander told him to leave, and after the door closed I explained that money was not the problem. The problem was a man assuming enough money could make the terms irrelevant. I agreed only after my own attorney rewrote the contract to prohibit surveillance, interference with my employment, control over my clothing, retaliation against anyone who offended me, and any attempt to prevent me from ending the arrangement. Alexander disliked several provisions but signed them without negotiation, while Richard read the final pages with an irritation he concealed badly. Before I added my signature, I asked Alexander whether he understood the most important condition, and he answered that if I told him I wanted to leave, he would let me go. At the time, I believed I was protecting myself from Alexander's power. I had no idea the person most threatened by that condition was standing quietly behind him. Our first dinner with the Whitmore family taught me that Richard preferred control exercised through architecture rather than force, because every chair, introduction, conversation topic, and seating arrangement seemed designed to remind people where they belonged. Evelyn sat opposite me in a dark green dress and treated me with cool courtesy until one of Alexander's cousins referred to me as the pastry manager, emphasizing the job as though Alexander had brought kitchen equipment to dinner. Alexander's hand shifted beside his wineglass, and I touched his wrist before he could intervene, then asked the cousin what he did for the family business. He gave a complicated answer involving strategic development, so I asked which projects he had personally developed. Evelyn covered a smile with her glass when his explanation became considerably shorter. The exchange would have been harmless except that Richard watched Alexander rather than me, studying whether he would tolerate my refusal to behave like a grateful guest. That was the first time I understood that Richard was not evaluating whether I embarrassed Alexander. He was measuring whether Alexander had begun allowing another person to influence him. Later, Richard steered the conversation toward a waterfront redevelopment project involving several old warehouses, expecting financial projections to restore the familiar hierarchy. I asked why every proposed tenant targeted tourists and wealthy residents when the surrounding blocks contained 2 colleges, a hospital complex, and thousands of workers who needed affordable places to eat. Evelyn's uncle requested the demographic reports, and within 20 minutes the family was discussing smaller commercial units and protected rents for local businesses. Alexander never announced that I had transformed the conversation or praised me like a child who had surprised adults. He simply asked questions that forced everyone to take the idea seriously. On the drive back to my apartment, he admitted that Richard had proposed luxury retail because the margins looked cleaner on paper, then asked what I would put there if the decision belonged to me. I described a bakery with good coffee, ordinary prices, and enough tables that nobody buying a $3 pastry would feel pressured to leave. By breakfast the following morning, the landlord negotiating the storefront I had pursued for 11 months emailed to say another buyer had acquired the building and my application was closed. I might have accepted bad timing if my hotel manager had not called me upstairs that afternoon and shown me an anonymous complaint alleging that I was using Blackstone resources for private catering connected to a hotel guest. The accusation mixed enough truth with invention to become dangerous, because I was being paid privately by Alexander while continuing to work at the hotel, although I had never used hotel supplies or staff for him. I produced my contract, schedules, and purchase records, and the manager cleared me after an uncomfortable review, but the message was obvious. Somebody knew enough about my life to create problems that looked accidental. Alexander wanted his security people to identify the source, and when I reminded him that investigating my co-workers without permission violated our agreement, frustration tightened his face. He argued that someone was deliberately targeting me, while I argued that danger did not automatically transfer ownership of the solution to him. We ended the conversation angry, and for the first time he broke one of my boundaries by ordering a security contractor to review the hotel's external cameras without telling me. I discovered it because the contractor approached my manager, who called me before releasing anything, and the betrayal hurt more than the original complaint. Alexander came to my apartment expecting an argument and received one, because I told him that agreeing with my boundaries only when they felt convenient was simply control with better manners. He insisted he had been trying to keep me safe, then stopped defending himself when I asked whether safety that required ignoring my explicit refusal was supposed to feel different from being managed. The next morning he canceled the investigation, apologized to my manager personally, and accepted that I would not attend a charity gala scheduled for that weekend because I needed distance from him. His mistake cost him something beyond an apology. For 9 days I saw him only at contractually required appearances, and whatever intimacy had begun developing between us disappeared. During that distance, Richard visited the Blackstone and remarked that Alexander had always struggled when people confused his responsibilities with control, a sentence calculated to make me believe the problem was permanent. Margaret invited me to tea near the end of those 9 days, and I expected another attempt to protect Alexander's reputation but found a woman considerably less interested in defending him than Richard seemed to be. She said Alexander had grown up watching men solve fear by controlling variables, and she hoped discomfort might teach him what obedience never had. Our conversation shifted toward my childhood, and when I mentioned that my mother, Emily, died in a highway accident when I was 6, Margaret's fingers tightened around her cup. She asked whether we had ever lived in Chicago, whether my mother had worked in accounting, and whether I remembered the Whitmore estate, questions too specific to be casual. As I put on my coat, I hummed the 4-note lullaby my mother used during thunderstorms, and Margaret asked where I had learned it before looking at the scar behind my ear. She recovered quickly, but I had spent my life reading rooms where I was underestimated, and I knew fear when I saw it. By the time I reached the street, the problems with my bakery and job no longer looked like attempts to end a fake romance. They looked like someone trying to remove me before I remembered something. I began with public records because they belonged to me as much as they belonged to Richard. And within 2 evenings I found an old Whitmore Foundation newsletter containing a photograph of my mother beside Margaret at a fundraising dinner. Emily had worked as a junior accounting coordinator for the foundation 29 years earlier, a fact my Aunt Carol had never mentioned despite telling me dozens of stories about my mother's jobs. More troubling was the ownership history of the bakery building, which showed that the company purchasing it after my application had been rejected was controlled by a development partnership supervised by Richard. When I showed Alexander the records, anger moved through him with the old instinctive certainty that had caused our first serious fight, but this time he asked what I wanted before making a call. I told him I wanted Richard unaware of how much we knew until I understood whether he was protecting the family from me, or protecting himself from whatever my mother had discovered. Alexander agreed, although I could see how much effort agreement cost him. Evelyn supplied the next piece without realizing its importance when she invited me to lunch and admitted Richard had managed sensitive Whitmore problems since Alexander's father, Charles, was alive. She remembered Emily's name from childhood arguments between Charles and Margaret, and she also remembered Richard arriving at their house during one of those arguments carrying accounting boxes from the foundation. Evelyn warned me that Richard was dangerous in a way outsiders often misunderstood. He rarely threatened anyone directly because his real talent was making employment disappear, financing collapse, permits stall, and allies reconsider whether knowing you remained worthwhile. Her description explained my bakery and hotel complaint, but it also made Alexander's family reputation suddenly less romantic than the stories people whispered about powerful men. Violence was easy to recognize, while administrative power could damage a life without leaving anything dramatic enough for witnesses. When I returned to the hotel that afternoon, Noah met me near the employee entrance and told me he had been suspended after security found expensive liquor in his locker. Noah swore the bottles were not his, and I believed him because the anonymous report accusing him had been filed less than an hour after he helped me search archived banquet records for events where Emily had worked. Hotel policy required suspension while management investigated, leaving a 19-year-old who helped support his younger sister without income because he had become useful to me. That consequence changed the investigation immediately. Richard was no longer merely interfering with my ambitions, and my decision to continue searching had placed someone with far less power in his path. Alexander offered to pay Noah's wages, but I refused because money from him would make Noah look compromised, then asked Alexander to help me locate independent legal counsel instead. The hotel eventually discovered that a temporary catering worker had entered the locker area before the bottles appeared, but the worker had already vanished from the staffing agency's records. For the first time I considered walking away from the truth, because courage feels considerably less noble when another person receives the invoice. Richard found me before I decided. Waiting in the hotel cafe after closing with a cup of coffee, he had no intention of drinking. He admitted nothing about Noah but asked whether my curiosity was worth damaging people who had never volunteered to participate, which confirmed enough without giving me evidence anyone could use. I asked what Emily had discovered, and his expression barely changed when he said my mother had mistaken partial information for moral certainty. According to Richard, Charles had moved money through charitable entities during a period when unions, contractors, and criminal crews were fighting for control of waterfront projects, and some payments had prevented violence rather than funded it. He claimed Emily wanted everything exposed without understanding that legitimate employees, families, and witnesses could have suffered from the fallout. His explanation contained enough uncomfortable possibility to stop me from treating him like a cartoon villain, yet it did not explain why he had targeted my bakery or Noah decades later. When I asked that directly, Richard told me some doors stayed closed because opening them served nobody. Alexander arrived before the conversation ended, having learned from my manager that Richard was there, and I watched him struggle between confronting the man who had practically helped raise him and honoring my request not to take control. Richard used that hesitation expertly, telling Alexander that Charles had understood leadership required carrying since other people were too comfortable to touch. Alexander asked whether Richard had planted the complaint against me, and Richard answered that protecting a family sometimes involved encouraging temporary inconveniences before permanent damage occurred. That was enough for Alexander to remove him from current Whitmore operations pending an outside review, but Richard responded with something neither of us expected. He placed an old photograph on the table showing Margaret holding a 6-year-old girl with blood near her left ear while Emily stood beside them, then looked directly at me. "Ask Margaret why your mother ran," he said, "and ask her what Alexander's father promised would happen if she came back." I drove to Wisconsin the following morning instead of confronting Margaret, because by then I understood that every Whitmore version of the past would contain loyalties I could not separate from facts. Aunt Carol stared at Richard's photograph for nearly a minute before admitting that Emily had arrived at her house terrified 23 years earlier, carrying me 2 suitcases and a locked document case she refused to explain. Carol had protected me by turning that silence into family habit, but Noah's suspension convinced her the old secret was harming people again. So she brought out a cardboard box of Emily's letters and financial papers. Most contained nothing dramatic, which made them more convincing. My mother worried about rent, school lunches, my habit of refusing vegetables, and whether she could find bookkeeping work without references from Chicago. Scattered through those ordinary concerns were references to duplicate ledgers, foundation accounts, cash withdrawals, and payments Charles had authorized through shell charities connected to waterfront contractors. One letter mentioned Margaret helping us leave, while another said Richard had discovered that copies existed. The box contained an expired safe deposit agreement, rather than the evidence itself, and finding what remained took 4 days of phone calls, archive requests, identification documents, and one expensive consultation with a records specialist. The original bank had merged twice, and the surviving institution confirmed only that Emily's box had been closed after her death, while the contents were released to Carol under an old beneficiary instruction she had forgotten signing. Carol searched her attic again and found a sealed envelope taped inside the lining of Emily's document case, but the papers inside were incomplete photocopies with transaction numbers rather than explanations. I spent part of my bakery savings hiring Mara Levin, a forensic accountant with no Whitmore connection, because I no longer trusted anyone whose paycheck depended on Alexander. Mara traced the numbers through historical corporate filings and discovered several payments routed from charitable accounts into consulting companies later, absorbed by legitimate Whitmore businesses. More important, she found later amendments signed by Richard that reclassified those payments after Charles died, suggesting someone had tried to sanitize the paper trail years after any immediate waterfront threat had passed. Before Mara could finish her report, someone broke into her office and took the external drive containing our scans, leaving computers, cash, and other client files untouched. She had encrypted backups offsite, so no evidence disappeared, but the message was impossible to mistake and finally pushed the danger beyond ruined leases and anonymous complaints. Alexander wanted me moved to one of his secured properties, and I almost refused from instinct until he asked whether we could choose a neutral hotel together instead. That distinction mattered because he had learned something from losing my trust. Yet the decision also forced me to admit that independence did not require rejecting sensible help merely to prove I could. We relocated Mara, Carol, and Noah temporarily, documented the break-in with police, and turned copies of everything over to outside counsel so no single person could bury the records. Richard denied ordering the burglary, and because we had no evidence tying him to it, Alexander refused to accuse him publicly despite wanting desperately to believe certainty could be created through anger. Margaret finally gave us the part she had hidden, explaining that Charles had inherited business relationships with organized crews controlling portions of the waterfront, and had continued making illegal payments after telling himself they protected workers from a conflict he was also profiting from. Emily discovered that charitable accounts were being used to disguise some transfers and threatened to report them, while Margaret secretly copied records and helped her leave Chicago after Charles warned that people dependent on those payments might come looking for whoever disrupted them. Margaret insisted Charles never ordered Emily harmed, and that Emily's later highway death was investigated as an ordinary accident, a conclusion supported by police records rather than family assurances. Her failure came afterward, when grief and fear allowed Richard to persuade her that exposing everything would endanger Alexander, employees, and witnesses for no benefit to Emily. She had remained silent, and Richard had spent years converting that silence into institutional policy. The explanation gave Richard a motive for frightening me away without proving he had ordered the burglary, which made what followed more damaging than a convenient confession. Mara discovered that the temporary worker who planted liquor in Noah's locker had been paid through a private investigations firm retained by one of Richard's personal companies, providing a documented connection to the campaign against me. Alexander immediately wanted Richard arrested for anything prosecutors could support, but I reminded him that Richard's wrongdoing did not grant us permission to invent the rest. That evening, I told Alexander the first was leaving our relationship until the investigation ended, because I could no longer distinguish my feelings for him from the pressure surrounding his family. He asked whether there was anything he could do to change my mind, and when I said no, he kept the promise he had made before any of us understood its cost. He opened the door, gave me the privacy arrangements I requested, and let me walk away. The next 12 days were the loneliest period of the investigation, partly because Alexander honored my decision so completely that I could no longer blame his presence for the choices I was making. Mara finished tracing enough transactions to recommend a formal independent review, while outside counsel warned that voluntary disclosure could trigger regulatory investigations, civil claims, lost financing, and scrutiny of current businesses that had never participated in Charles's conduct. The stakes stopped being abstract when lenders suspended negotiations on the waterfront redevelopment, and two partners threatened to withdraw if Alexander opened historical records voluntarily. Thousands of employees were not going to lose their jobs overnight, as Richard had implied, but projects could fail and innocent people could suffer financially. For the first time, I understood why Margaret had once found silence tempting, and that understanding made her decision more tragic rather than more acceptable. Morality became harder when the wrong choice offered visible people immediate protection, while the right one promised consequences nobody could calculate. Richard asked to meet me in the presence of attorneys, and the man who arrived looked older than he had 2 weeks earlier because Alexander had removed his access to the machinery that once made him untouchable. He admitted ordering the pressure on my landlord, the hotel complaint, and the operation against Noah, although he continued denying any involvement in Mara's burglary. His justification was painfully consistent. He believed I would eventually force Alexander to expose records capable of damaging businesses Richard had spent decades stabilizing. When I asked whether he understood that Noah could have lost his career before it started, Richard said he had planned to restore the boy's job after I withdrew, as though returning something he had stolen transformed the theft into strategy. I told him that was the problem with men who called themselves protectors. After enough years, they began treating other people's lives as pieces they were entitled to move. Richard looked at me for a long time before admitting Emily had said almost the same thing. His admission did not redeem him, but it gave me the final emotional truth I needed before meeting Alexander at the independent board session. Richard presented the financial consequences of disclosure himself because Alexander insisted the board hear the strongest argument for silence, and for nearly an hour the choice remained genuinely difficult. Several directors argued that Charles was dead. The oldest crimes might be beyond prosecution, and current employees should not pay for a previous generation's misconduct. Alexander listened, then admitted his own failure publicly. After meeting me, he had violated a written boundary because fear convinced him that good intentions excused control, which was the same reasoning his family had used on a vastly larger scale. He said he could not condemn Richard for manipulating people, while preserving a system that rewarded the manipulation whenever it benefited him. The board voted to preserve all records, appoint outside investigators, notify relevant authorities, and cooperate with any lawful inquiry. Even if disclosure cost Alexander control of assets, his father had spent a lifetime accumulating. Richard resigned before the vote became public, but the consequences did not end neatly with his departure. Police later connected Mara's burglary to a contractor who had previously worked for the same investigations firm Richard used against Noah, although available evidence did not establish that Richard ordered the break-in, and the story resisted the satisfying simplicity of making one man responsible for every wrong. Alexander sold 2 properties to stabilize financing, abandoned an acquisition, and removed executives who had participated in later concealment. Margaret gave investigators a complete statement that exposed her own silence rather than protecting her reputation, while Noah received an apology, back pay, and a written correction from the hotel without owing Alexander anything. My bakery savings were nearly gone because I had spent them on lawyers, accounting, travel, and the investigation, which meant uncovering my mother's truth had cost me the dream that originally brought Alexander into my life. He came to see me after the board announcement and stood outside the Blackstone until my shift ended, making no attempt to enter the kitchen or turn reconciliation into another public gesture. He told me he had once believed loving someone meant eliminating whatever could hurt her, while losing me had forced him to understand that love sometimes meant remaining close enough to help without becoming the person who decided. I told him understanding the lesson did not automatically restore what his mistake had damaged, and he said he knew. Several weeks passed before we began having coffee again, then dinner, then ordinary evenings in which neither of us discussed contracts, investigations, or whether the relationship was progressing according to some invisible schedule. When Alexander eventually proposed, he did it in my apartment without photographers, family jewelry, or a restaurant full of witnesses, and before answering I asked whether he understood that marriage would never convert my freedom into a promise of permanence. He said he wanted a wife who could leave and chose not to, because anything else would only be another contract written by fear. I accepted because, for the first time, staying felt entirely like my decision. That was how I arrived at the chapel 7 weeks later, and heard people laughing before Margaret entered with the last piece of a story she had spent 23 years trying not to remember. After telling me Richard had known my identity from the beginning, she explained why my scar had frightened her. On the night she helped Emily leave Chicago, a thunderstorm knocked out power at the estate, and 6-year-old me ran through a dark garden looking for my mother before falling against the edge of a stone bench. Margaret had held a towel against the cut behind my ear while Emily packed copies of financial records, singing the same 4-note lullaby I later hummed during tea. Richard arrived before we escaped and saw Margaret carrying me to the car, which meant he had recognized my name and scar as soon as his background research for Alexander uncovered them. His original contract offer had never been random research performed for a demanding client. Richard had deliberately priced the arrangement to tempt me, believing 3 controlled months would let him determine what Emily had told me and quietly remove me if necessary. Alexander asked Margaret why she had not told us immediately when she recognized my name weeks earlier, and her answer was less flattering than grief might have made it. She had been afraid that admitting the connection would expose her own role before she was ready, so she had delayed until investigators forced her to confront how closely hesitation resembled the silence she regretted. I appreciated the absence of excuses because apologies become useless when they are designed to preserve the speaker's self-image. Then Alexander turned to me in front of the minister and asked whether I wanted to continue, even though postponing the wedding would create another week of headlines and humiliation for a family already drowning in both. I looked at the guests who had laughed because they believed the important question was why a man like Alexander would choose a woman like me, and I realized their judgment no longer required an answer. I told Alexander the first wanted to marry him, and the ceremony continued without anyone pretending that discovering my mother's courage had somehow increased my value. The months afterward were harder and less glamorous than the wedding photographs suggested. Alexander's empire became smaller as investigations unwound old partnerships, and although prosecutors ultimately focused on provable financial misconduct and obstruction, rather than the mythology surrounding the Whitmore name, several executives faced charges while Richard entered a cooperation agreement, after his documented interference with witnesses and records became impossible to defend. The burglary remained officially attributed to the contractor who committed it because evidence never proved Richard ordered that act, and I was strangely grateful for the unresolved edge. Real justice should follow evidence rather than satisfying narrative symmetry. Margaret funded no memorial and asked for no public forgiveness from me, choosing instead to testify, surrender records, and live with the discomfort of people knowing what she had failed to do. Alexander lost money, influence, and several relationships he once considered permanent, but he gained something less visible when employees began disagreeing with him without first checking whether disagreement was safe. My bakery took longer because I refused Alexander's offer to finance it, although refusing him did not magically make